Hi, in this video we're going to be talking about sustainable fruit growing. And what is sustainability? Well, there are really two parts to it. One part is the environmental sustainability, which obviously has a big impact on day-to-day life, water quality, and the food we eat. And secondly, we're going to look at economic sustainability, because if nobody makes this work financially, we will run out of food. So in the industrial orchards that we have now, there is a constant spray regime. And the spraying is done as weed killers to kill off all the ground cover and to keep the soil bare. There's also a lot of spraying that's done for insect life. There's sprays that are done on the fruits at the moment. They'll be done throughout the season. They're done during the winter. There's a consistent use of sprays, some of which are very toxic and have a huge impact on insect life, but also have a long-term effect on human health, because the fruit that's bought from those orchards is always going to be contaminated to some point with pesticide residues. Even at very low parts per billion, they have an impact. And that's a big worry. We've also got herbicides, which are potentially damaging human health as well, because they work at parts per billion. And fungicides. All of those sprays have a long-term impact, not only on human health, but a massive impact on the environment where the trees are grown. And that leads to very low species diversity in those types of orchards. We're losing a lot of insects, and one of the great things about a traditional old heritage orchard is a tremendous amount of insect life that we're able to have. In modern commercial orchards, there's a second big problem, and that's the use of synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers have three major issues. One is the fact that they are very carbon intensive. To make a fertilizer like a nitrate or an ammonium, phosphate, potassium, they all cost a huge amount of carbon. They consistently need a huge amount of petrochemical, and they generate a lot of CO2. And every year their use increases. Also, a second problem, there's massive runoff from those sorts of fertilizers. It ends up in the water table, gets into the drinking water, contamination of river systems and the sea, causing algal blooms, and ultimately has a massive impact on life as we know it on the planet. And the third problem is that when they're put into the plants and when they're put on the soil, they kill off the biology of the soil, and that has a really bad effect on the health of the plants. Put all of that together, it makes no sense at all to use synthetic fertilizers. They make no economic sense, and environmentally they're very harmful. The last thing I want to talk about under environmental sustainability is soil oxidation. This is a problem that comes about where soil is allowed to remain uncovered and bare. In most agricultural systems and orchards, bare soil is the norm, and that's seen as healthy and clean and tidy, but in fact it leads to environmental problems, particularly that the soil itself oxidizes under the presence of UV light and chemical sprays. And what that does is it makes the soil become very inert, and any nutrients in there, for example like iron, manganese, become very unavailable very quickly. This has a huge negative impact on crop growth. And on top of that, it oxidizes the carbon, so the soil starts to give out a huge amount of carbon dioxide, and the microbes in the soil tend to perish very quickly. So you don't store carbon in the soil, you release carbon, and the soil itself becomes very inhospitable to the very crops you're trying to grow. What we do here is we never leave the soil bare, and you can see Phacelia growing here in this patch of ground that was bare amongst this new permaculture crop of cherries and rhubarb, and because we've got the ground covered, they're able to energize the soil with carbohydrate, cycle the carbon, and keep hold of it. And if you look at the wider orchard, you can see we continuously keep it grassed and grazed with our sheep. So that means that soil's never exposed, never oxidized. And most importantly, the soil stores water and carbon very efficiently. We've talked about environmental sustainability. Now let's talk about financial sustainability. When you're growing a crop and you're spending thousands of pounds per acre every year just on sprays and fertilizer, on irrigation water and crop inputs like that, you are going to be very vulnerable. You're going to need to have a high yield, if not every year, then many years, just to get the money back that you've spent. And when you're spending huge amounts on growing a crop in that way, it's not very sustainable. So not only is conventional farming system a very high input cost, it can in many cases, and recent research has shown this, significantly reduce your yield. And it does this because it harms the intermediate microbiome of the soil. We're moving out of a chemical-driven production system to a biological farming system. And the reason we're doing it really is economic, because it's far more financially viable once you rely on the soil biology to drive your system, much more reliable than the chemical system. So thankfully, there is an answer to this environmental and financial problem, and it's called regenerative agriculture. Look at this Tom-Putt apple, how healthy this tree really is, and the amount of crop that we've got on there. This tree has never been sprayed with any pesticides, and it's never been given any conventional fertilizer. And as a result, you can see the amount of yield that we've got. We spend tens of pounds per acre on inputs, not thousands. One of the foundational principles of regenerative agriculture is that you're spending very low amounts on inputs. You're saving a huge amount on cost initially, so you're starting from a much stronger position. So regenerative agriculture is not just about stopping doing things and reducing inputs and walking away. We actively manage the system here to solve the two problems that all growers face. One is soil nutrition, plant nutrition, and secondly, pest management. Okay, so let's talk about soil nutrition under the regenerative system first. This is clover. This is one of our key plants that we have in the orchard. It's spread itself around, and what it's really good at doing is capturing free nitrogen and supplying it back into the microbiome of the plants and the soil at large. And it's an indicator of all the free nitrogen that we've got access to here. The atmosphere that we're breathing is 79% nitrogen. All of that nitrogen is free to any grower if they know how to access it. We use two major ways in. One is nitrogen fixing plants like vetches and clover, and the other one is the bacteria that live in the soil like Azotobacter, which are able to fix nitrogen and supply it back into the roots of the trees. And the really good news is that that nitrogen does not pollute water systems, does not turn up in drinking water, does not flow out to sea, it doesn't cost us any money, and most importantly of all, it goes into the roots and it goes in as protein, which is far more efficient for the plant. The plant therefore needs a third less water than it would if we supplied nitrate. Nitrates cost the plant a huge amount of water because they have to be converted to protein in the plant roots. That's very dehydrating for a plant. Also affects the flavour of the crop, makes the crop a lot more expensive in terms of water supply and fertilizer. So you can see immediately how much money we've saved by using this natural source of nitrogen. Soil nutrition is not just about nitrogen supply, it's also about phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, iron, sulfur, and a whole range of very crucial trace elements, many of which are hard to get hold of in oxidized soil. So you can see in this tree, we've got beautiful crop. This is an Aylesbury prune, an old heritage variety. And the reason that we're able to achieve this very healthy growth is because we use a combination of biostimulants, seaweed in the summer, and also remineralizing rock dust, volcanic dust in the winter, combined with sustainable grazing. See our videos on those practices if you're interested. But by doing that, we spend very low amounts of money on inputs, but we get a huge financial return on that. So how do we manage without constant spraying of pesticides? How are we getting rid of pests, or how are we preventing pests and diseases on crops? This is Claygate Pearman, which is a very reliable old russet apple with an amazing flavour. But it's an example where you can see there's a good crop and we've got these very healthy leaves. And we're getting this healthy growth because the trees have a great relationship with their microbiome. They're driven by the biology in the soil. The bacteria and the fungi are able to bring in all the nutrients that they need. In exchange, they get the sugars pumped out by the roots of the trees. There's a very healthy relationship there, and that drives the health of the tree and protects it from aphids and caterpillars, plum curculio type weevils, all the normal pests that have to be sprayed against, codling moth. None of them are really there. But secondly, we invest and actively manage the habitat in the orchard to bring in a huge range of predatory insects. They feed on the flowers that we have here. We have pollinators in abundance here. And we have a constant supply of bird life, which you can hear All of this vegetation that we have here supplies a huge range of habitat and also ensures that the soil itself is at peak health. And that raises the immunity of the plant, and in conjunction with that immunity, it's supported by these free services that we've actively managed. So we just want to talk about water management and why we spend no money on irrigation here. We have an incredibly healthy microbiome here, which is able to bring in free water from deep within the soil, from the subsoil, stored over the winter and brought to the tree in exchange for sugar, which is a natural system. And secondly, because we don't use nitrate fertilizers, we're not wiping out this microbiome. And thirdly, we're using vigorous rootstocks, which are able to tap into the water supply and don't need mollycoddling. They don't need a constant supply of irrigation. They have a deep system of roots. They don't have surface roots. And they supply a much more vigorous growth, which we manage into a narrow cordon system. And we still get our crops early on. So it's a very cheap way to irrigate crops. Okay, so let's summarize the benefits of regenerative agricultural systems here. We have completely reduced our input costs to tens of pounds per acre. We haven't sacrificed yield. We're getting at least as good a yield as you'd get with a conventional system. But we've also created very good carbon storing soil, which is able to capture carbon and hold it and take it out of the atmosphere, which is a benefit for climate change. On top of that, we're creating a wildlife habitat and an environment which is very sustainable and allows the protection of landscapes from species extinction, threatened insects, pollinators, bird life can nest here, animals live here. We have an incredible ecosystem here, all of which that supports our crop. And ultimately, we've created an environment that is financially sustainable, but environmentally sustainable.